Welcome to the best books of classic literature in 2023, arbitrarily assigned by me. I'm going to be doing 4 lists of best books this year. I'm going to be doing a classic literature, which is where you are here. I have already done one that looks at my favorite books that have come out in the 21st century, and then I'm going to do my favorite books of nonfiction, and I'm going to do my favorite books of children's and young adults as well. So I really love classic literature. This was by far my most read genre of this year, and I loved it so much that I considered not reading anything else in 2024. There's something about reading classic literature that makes me so insanely happy and immersed and all of those things. I have begun the year with classic literature in 2024, the few that I read already. They are big, chunky books, and I'm really happy for this. This has a lot of large books on the list, and that is something that I was previously afraid of, that I really have come in and encountered and enjoyed so much. Let us begin with my first surprising book of the year. This was my second or third book of the year, and it was a book that I did not want to read. I read it because I was going to read a retelling, and I was like, it's short, and I bought it for like $1 on my shelf a long time ago, so I guess I should read it. And this is The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, and I was so wrong. I adore this book. It was translated from the German and originally came out in 1914, so 110 years ago this year. And this looks at a boy who is a young man, and he's the breadwinner for his family, and he is dealing with some anxiety, some stress, and one day he wakes up and he is a beetle, a giant beetle, and he is like, oh no, I must hide from my family. And it is thematic, it is interesting, it is funny, it is tragic. I read it and then immediately picked up my physical copy and just started looking through the different words, because the way that he is able to talk about so many social and political issues and being a burden and illness, and it was so intensely good, concise, having moments of humor, having moments of horror at the ways in which people who are diseased are treated, and the repulsion of his family. And I was in love with it. I really wanted to read more Franz Kafka in 2023 and didn't get around to it. So 2024 is the year where I dive more into his rest of his books, because I was grossed out by bugs, so I didn't want to read it, and I'm so glad that I did. Another author that I gave another try after having mixed reaction to his previous works was Oscar Wilde. I ended up reading, I think, 6 books of his this year, and pretty much any of them could be on my favorites list, but I chose the most impactful and powerful one for me, and that was The Ballad of Reading Gaol by Oscar Wilde. And this book was his one and only post-imprisonment book. Oscar Wilde was a gay man, and he was in prison for gross indecency. He went from a very silly, ostentatious man who loved luxury and loved indulgence and really believed that art should not matter more than it does. A lot of his books do have a lot of social critique and other elements of it, but he thought that if you added politics or themes or social issues into books too much, it kind of loses the glamour, and we're looking for glamour, we're not looking for hard issues. And then he spent 2 years in hard labor. He did not have a name, he was called by a number, and he was in solitary confinement for large amounts of the time. And they were doing work that was manual labor, but it was also useless labor. It wasn't building something. It was literally just labor because they wanted them to punish them. And it was brutal and dehumanizing. And he came out and he would die within 2 years because he was so wasted, even though he was only in his mid-40s at the time. And he wrote this awe-inducing, really emotional, really poetic, long epic poem called The Ballad of Reading Gaol. And I was transfixed. I read so many lines, and I underlined pretty much every line in my collection, and I was like, I have to stop, because it is so powerful. He really talks about the stripping of humanity and how people are physically and emotionally abused and neglected, but also spiritually. He talks about how they're trying to repent for their souls, but they're not even allowed to do that in privacy, and it is so incredible. I wanted to read a few lines. These are not connected lines, but these are just lines that I thought were really powerful. And blood and wine were on his hands when they found him with the dead, who watch him when he tries to weep and when he tries to pray. He does not know the sickening thirst that stands on one's throat. He does not pray with lips of clay. What words of grace in such a place could help a brother's soul? And there's so many beautiful lines, so poetic, but so heart-wrenching. The fact that their thirst felt like sandpaper. And it's talking about how we're also dehumanizing soldiers. So a lot of those lines were talking about soldiers that were in place of them and standing there, but they were not allowed to extend mercy. So we're trying to make ways in which the soldiers will not empathize with the prisoners. It is an incredibly powerful anti-prison poem from the 1890s. And I think that it really still reflects the ways in which the prison system is unfair and dehumanizes people. Whether they are guilty of crimes or not, it does not matter. But the way in which people are treated, and we take the humanity of someone and we twist it and we make them something that is not human and not worthy of empathy because of a crime. And I think that is just so incredibly powerful. North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is often compared to Pride and Prejudice, and it is referred to a socialist 1850s Pride and Prejudice. And I love it and I agree, and I think that is one of the things that is so impactful. We follow Margaret Hale, and she is a woman who grew up in London on the care of her aunt and uncle, and she is quite poor. Her father is a clergyman. And then we also follow John Milton, and he is a person who grew up in poverty, grew up in a lot of hardship, and he has now risen and has become a mill owner. And he has a relationship with his mother that's very interesting, and their lives collide when Margaret's father decides that he cannot stand the things that he disagrees with the Anglican Church, and he becomes a dissenter, thus nullifying his genteel role because he cannot be a clergyman anymore. And instead he moves to Milton, which is a fictionalized version of Manchester, which is a huge industrial place in the mid-19th century. And he becomes a tutor to John Milton, who again does not have a lot of formal education because of the fact that he grew up in poverty. And their lives collide when we have Pride and we have Prejudice. We have Margaret becoming really involved with social programs and with the care of the poor, and we have a lot of conversation on religion, which is super good and interesting, about the various ways that people intersect with religion and the problems that organized religion has for people in poverty. And these characters have very good chemistry, very good interesting conversations, and they change each other. We see the ways in which each become better understanding, whether it is understanding the poverty and understanding workers' rights, whether it's understanding the gap between people who were born rich and people who have become rich. I really loved it. The only really complaint that I have is, first of all, that it was a little slow to start. It took me a while when she was in Helston before she got to Milton, that I was not as much involved. But once she gets to Milton, I'm gold. And then also the end is a little quick. And the reason for it being a little shorter is that Elizabeth Gaskell originally had it serialized in one of Charles Dickens' collections of newspapers, and he wanted it wrapped up, so she didn't really have a choice but to wrap it up quicker than she would have liked, which is absurd, my dear Chuck, because you write the longest books imaginable. So the fact that you made Elizabeth Gaskell cut this novel short is an outrage. The next book I'm going to talk about is Whose Names Are Unknown, and this novel has a very interesting story about it because technically it was published in 2004, which would obviously not make it a classic, but it was originally slated for publication in 1939. Sonora Babb had a life and a half. It's really interesting to look into her life. She was born in Oklahoma and then moved to California, where she would become a writer and a journalist and become a person who worked in camps and helped with social work and wrote many, many notes. And she would also have a long-standing marriage with an Asian director, and their marriage was not legally ratified for over 10 years because of the fact of anti-interracial marriage laws. And then she also had an affair with Ralph Ellison, very renowned and interesting Black novelist of the mid-20th century as well. So she had her hands in so many interesting things. Also, a few times met John Steinbeck, who actually caused her writing career to be dismantled. Whether he stole her writing or not is completely a little bit up to. We know that her supervisor gave her very detailed notes from working as a social worker to John Steinbeck, who then incorporated many of them into his novel. And then when his novel became very successful, people did not want to compete, and her novel was shelved for over 60 years because it was considered imitative, and despite the fact that he literally imitated and stole her family history and story. So that is horrendous. Whether he did it intentionally or knew all of those things or was more accepted in that era, etc., etc., it is terrible that her writing career got deterred, and this was published in her 90s, 1 year before she died. This is a book that is very rooted in her Oklahoma roots, and during the time that she was living in California, her mother was writing her the stories of the Sandstones, and it is horrific. It tells a lot of stories in which these characters are going through so much. As someone who's known about the dust storms, who's known about the Great Depression, like, this book hit me and made me understand some of the effects of that way more. The fact that people were dying of suffocation because of these storms is, like, insane. And she tells with such tenderness and emotion. There's a quote that I shared in my favorite books of the year from Wandering Souls that says that she's trying to carve out something between the macabre and the fairy tale, and I think that Nora Bab captures that so beautifully. She captures the love and compassion and emotionality of these neighbors who are helping each other after miscarriage, after death, after poverty, and after all of these things, they're helping each other. And then we're also seeing the fact that terrible things are happening. I think that this was a really powerful novel that dealt with really hard topics in a really human way, and I would have loved to see the alternative history when this was a classic being taught in schools instead of Grapes of Wrath. Another late entry to my favorites is New Grub Street by George Gissing. And this is a book that I've been intrigued for a long time because it is a book about writers, which is one of my favorite things. You know, I'm a girl who likes to read and I'm a girl who likes to write, so I love to read books about writing. And this is when writing has become a trade, and it follows these two writers that are at odds with each other, but also kind of frenemies. There's one of them who is a little bit of a Scandi wanderer, and he is a person who goes around and he spends his mother's fortune, wanders around London, learning and interacting with people, and, you know, just twittering away his mother's fortune to the huge effect of his younger sisters who would really rely on that. It has very Sense and Sensibility vibes where he's like, well, I need to experience culture before I can really encounter my world. And his sisters are like, yeah, but you know, when our mom dies, we don't have any money unless she has money to put aside, and you're using all of that money on things where you could be, you know, working for your own bread. And we can't do that because we're women. And it's very interesting. And then we have this other guy who is married and he's in love and he has all of these things and he has huge writer's block. He has previously had successful books, but he is not able to now actually get out of the hole, and he's worried that he's not writing good. And we have these two men that know each other, and we have various other people around them as well. But these are the two men that represent these sides of the new kind of art as trade and art as art. And it's very interesting to see these characters, and it is a very long book. I think that I would have liked it to be shorter in some places because it went too long, but it is really graphic in some places in the ways of starvation, and I thought that that was very powerful. We have these people who literally are not eating because they cannot feed themselves, but they're also this genteel poverty. So I'm going to talk about Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope, and this was my 6th Anthony Trollope of the year and my 8th overall, and Anthony Trollope has just solidified himself as one of my favorite authors this year. This is the first book of his second series, the Palliser novels, and this is Can You Forgive Her, and it is about these various women who are in situations where they may need forgiveness, may not. He is very funny and very personal as a narrator. I love that. He will go in and he will talk about them. He will describe someone who has done something unfavorable and say, but these are also his good qualities. And as we get on in the novel, we also learn and know that some of the characters are leaving because he will be like, and we say farewell to them, which I find his narration and his humor and his really intimate personal stories really good. We have a widow who married an older man and is now a wealthy widow, and she's in mourning and she could never ever marry again, but she's flirting with everyone. It's hilarious. And Cora and Palliser, and they have a very interesting relationship in which they are misunderstanding each other time and time again. And then we also have a relationship between our main girl, Alice, who was previously engaged to a rascal and is now engaged to a very sensible man, and then she goes to Switzerland with her cousin, and who is the rascal who she was previously engaged to, because, you know, Victorian times, and you can have previously been engaged to your cousin because, you know. And yeah, things ensue. One of the quotes that I really loved from this is, poetry is precious because it suggests more than it declares. I have long fancied myself a fan of E.M. Forster, but this was my first novel actually by him, which, you know, is great. This is A Room with a View, and it was published in the early 20th century, and I love this era that has all of the changing things, and we have the Victorian era colliding with the 1920s, and in this space we have, you know, the early 19th century with so much invention and change and development, and then we have World War I, and it's so interesting to see all of these things. And this is set a little bit before this, and I find it such a fascinating novel. I love the different characters. I love the writing. The writing is exquisite. I love funny human narration, and some of the characters that I did not expect to love are given such introspection that I was shocked by. And I laughed out loud and I smiled so much during this novel. One of my longest reviews this year was The Small House at Allington. And this is another book by Anthony Trollope. This book stands in place for all of the Barsetshire books, and its next contender for being the representation was Dr. Thorne, which was my first of his books that just launched 1,000 ships of 6 books, and one of my first books of the year is a 7th book by him, and I am so in love with the way that he tells stories. And this one is a little tragic, a little melancholic, but so beautiful. We follow this small house, so pretty much what happened is that we have this man who is a squire and he's a bachelor, and he has 2 younger brothers that both had children. One of them has a son, and he is a little bit of rapscallion, and then the youngest one married a woman that he did not like and had 2 daughters. And then after his death, he invited them in to live in the small house. So it is a smaller house on the property. If you read Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, it is a similar environment to that. And it is so interesting because we follow these love stories and the ways in which, you know, all of them want the cousins to get married and the cousins don't want to get married, or one of the cousins doesn't want to get married. Small House at Allington I love so much because it looks at unrequited love in a really interesting and feminist way. I love the way that he looks at these characters and allows them to have different dreams and different ambitions. And I fell in love with this book so much. I love the really human, really interesting stories that Anthony Trollope tells. I love his humor, the way that he personally tells these stories. And this one just really drew my heart. It has a little bit more of London than the previous Barsetshire books, but I really love the way that we looked at these various characters and the way they interact, and they fall in love and they fall out of love and they don't love people anymore. And I think these characters come alive to me. I feel these characters in my heart still. I think about Lily Dale a lot, and I think about the various things that happened, and it feels very real to me. And the relationships are funny and human, whether it's someone who's an old squire who, you know, yells because he's not very good at, like, you know, talking normally and he can't show emotions, to, you know, the guy wandering around reading poetry in the wilderness, and, you know, unrequited love and blonde love and betrayal and hurt and inability to speak when you're in love with someone. It's just, oh, it's all so great and beautifully written and funny. One of my favorite books of this year were Gentlemen Prefer Blondes by Anita Loos. I did an entire review about this way back in June, I believe, and it was a splash of fun. I loved the humor, I loved the characters. I find it so refreshing to see women who are skirting the ways of patriarchy. And this is published in 1925, the same year of The Great Gatsby. So we know the Roaring Twenties, we know all of these things. And in many ways, it feels like a book like that from a female perspective, because we see luxury, we see women who are not actually that rich being able to convince people of. And I find it so great. It is written in epistolary form of journal entries, and we have this main character who is learning to be educated and all of these things, and she is just hilarious. I love her so much. I laughed out loud so much. I own the second book now and I really need to get to that one, and I would really, really recommend this book. And we are going to finish on my favorite classic of the year in heart-wrenching style, and this is The Forbidden Notebook by Elba D. Cepitis. And this is a translated book from Italy, and I am so glad that I picked this book up because it is in my heart. It is from 1952. It follows this woman who is 43 years old. She's been married for over 20 years and she has 2 grown-up children. And they live in this small, cramped apartment. She is from a noble background, but because of the wars and the various other things, they have now descended into lower income, but they want to present still sometimes as respectable. And there's so much conversation about feminism and wealth and poverty and how we can't talk about our conversations with our family, with our children. She's writing this diary and she's expressing all of her feelings, but she's hiding it from everyone else. She's hiding it in various places because she doesn't have a room of her own. And it is so marvelous. I wrote down so many lines. I felt like it rang through the decades. It felt so contemporary and real. And I felt so many feelings for these people. And I'm so thankful that more of her work is going to be translated in the future. It's just marvelous. One of the quotes that I thought was really good was just narration. Even though we love each other so much, we protect ourselves from each other like enemies. And then this one, which is just so interesting because it's about a conversation between the mother and daughter, and it's them feeling similar things, but the mother feeling like she can't morally and respectably answer in a way that she would want to. With a shudder, I erased thoughts in myself and told my daughter that her enthusiasm is all due to novelty. This quote is about her and her husband. I would have liked to talk to him, to be frank, but something restrained me, gagged me almost. The desperate certainty that words were no longer enough to overcome the silence that was piling up between us. Like, just, it cuts to the core in such beauty and delicacy and humanness. And I really love that in classics. I love to feel like the characters are real, they're live, that they cut into emotions. And I think all of these books really, really look at the characters that just have such real stories and such humor and humanity. If I was to give a few honorable mentions at the end, I would give one to Oliver Twist. I have a review of this as well. I really liked it, and especially it was one of my first Charles Dickens that I really liked. I also reread A Christmas Carol. I read it way back in the day and I had been less than impressed, and this time it sunk into my heart and it was so beautiful and wonderful. I also wanted to give a shout out to The Light Princess by George MacDonald. I thought this was a great fairy tale and classic children's book. And Dr. Thorne, again, one of my favorite of Anthony Trollope's. I just couldn't include 3 Anthony Trollope, that would be a little bit much. I also loved A Woman of No Importance by Oscar Wilde. I also had such a special spot for Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell, but I ended up missing the end of that book by a smidge, and it ended up being my first book of 2024. So technically it doesn't count. It would have been on the list probably if I had finished it in 2023. So that is my collection of favorite books that are of classic literature. I would love to know some of your favorites. I will see you next time. Bye.